They called her name like it was a mistake. Carter. Captain Nolan Briggs didn't look up from his clipboard when he said it. He said it the way you'd read a wrong address off a package. Flat, dismissive, already done with her before she'd had a chance to respond. Emily Carter, step off the aircraft. She was 3 rows back, just settling into the aisle seat she'd been assigned, bag already stowed, still wearing the Navy scrubs she hadn't had time to change out of after a 12-hour overnight trauma shift. The overhead lights of the military-chartered Meridian air transport were harsh and white. Every pair of eyes in the cabin turned toward her. "Excuse me?" she said. "You heard me." Now he looked up. Captain Briggs was broad-shouldered, silver-templed, with the kind of face that had been told yes so many times it had forgotten what no felt like. He walked the aisle toward her with his chin slightly elevated, clipboard pressed to his chest like a shield. "This is a secured military transport. You're in the wrong seat on the wrong flight." "I have authorization." Emily kept her voice even. She reached into the front pocket of her bag and pulled out the travel order. 2 pages, official Department of Defense letterhead, her name printed clearly at the top, the authorization code highlighted in yellow the way her former unit's admin sergeant had always insisted on. She held it out to him. Briggs took it, looked at it for roughly 4 seconds, handed it back. "This doesn't clear you for this aircraft. It clears me for military transport to Black Ridge for the veteran recognition ceremony on the 14th. She didn't raise her voice. "That's today. This is the flight." "Ma'am," he said it like a period, "I'm going to need you to gather your belongings and exit the aircraft. Security will assist you." "Captain, security!" 2 airport security officers appeared at the forward door as if they'd been waiting. Because they had been. Someone had already radioed ahead. Emily looked at Briggs for a long moment, really looked at him, the way she'd learned to look at men like him in the Army, men who confused authority with accuracy. And then she stood up. She pulled her bag from the overhead bin without rushing. She moved toward the front of the aircraft at her own pace, not his. Every passenger watched. A few shifted uncomfortably. One older man in a veteran's ball cap, VFW embroidered in gold, met her eyes briefly with an expression that said he'd seen this kind of thing before and hated it every time. She stepped off the jet bridge and into the terminal corridor. That was 7:42 in the morning. By 8:09, everything on that runway would be on fire. Emily Voss Carter had joined the Army at 22, fresh out of a nursing program at Caldwell State University that she'd completed in 3 years because she didn't see the point in taking 4. She hadn't joined because she'd had some crystallizing moment of patriotic purpose. She joined because she was good at staying calm in situations designed to make people fall apart, and because the Army, at the time, seemed like the one institution that would actually let her use that skill. She'd been right. Her first deployment sent her to a forward operating base outside a place most Americans couldn't find on a map, where the trauma bay was a reinforced tent and the nearest surgical support was 40 minutes by helicopter on a good day. She'd worked with 2 other nurses and a physician's assistant named Reyes, who chewed the same brand of spearmint gum from breakfast to lights out, and had the steadiest hands Emily had ever seen on a human being. They had treated blast wounds, crush injuries, infections that had gone septic before anyone had a chance to catch them, and the kind of burns that required you to keep your face completely neutral so the patient wouldn't panic reading your expression. Emily had learned, in that tent, that most of what looks like courage is actually just focus. You don't think about what's wrong. You think about the next step, and then the step after that, and you keep moving until there are no more steps to take. She'd done 2 deployments, came home, transitioned out at 26, took a job at Harwick Medical Center in Caldwell, the city where she'd gone to school, which had a trauma unit that handled half the region's severe cases. Worked nights, picked up extra shifts when the floor was short, told herself she'd figure out the rest of her life later. What she hadn't told anyone, what hadn't made it into the conversation with Captain Briggs because he hadn't given her the chance, was what she'd been doing for the past 18 months. A classified contract through a Department of Defense medical training initiative called Program Callaway, which trained military trauma nurses for mass casualty response in austere environments. She'd written 2 sections of the field protocol manual. She'd led training cycles at Fort Orland and at the Mirror Ridge Joint Medical Facility. She'd flown to Black Ridge twice before, both times under the same authorization code that Briggs had looked at for 4 seconds before deciding it wasn't real. But she was standing in a terminal corridor now, in her scrubs, with her bag on her shoulder, watching her flight sit at the gate 50 feet away. She pulled out her phone, dialed her DoD liaison, a civilian named Marcus Webb, who had the energy of a man who hadn't slept since 2019 and processed stress exclusively through dark humor. He picked up on the second ring. "Webb." "I'm off the aircraft," she said. "The captain pulled my authorization and had security escort me out." A pause. What?" "Briggs, Nolan Briggs. He said my clearance didn't cover this flight." "Emily, that authorization code covers every military transport in the Meridian Air Network for the next 30 days. I generated it myself." "I know that." "Did you show him the—" "Yes." Another pause, longer this time. She could hear him typing. "Okay, I'm pulling the flight manifest right now. Okay, your name is on it. Your seat is assigned. You are cleared, documented, but I'm going to call the Air Operations Coordinator." He exhaled. "This is going to take me 20 minutes. "Understood." She sat down on a bench near the gate window. Through the glass, she could see the aircraft sitting on the tarmac. A Meridian Air 400 series, military transport configuration, the kind she'd flown on half a dozen times. Ground crew moved around it in the early morning light, doing the standard pre-departure checks. One of them, a young guy in orange coveralls, maybe mid-20s, was crouched near the rear landing gear assembly, running something along the underside of the housing. Emily watched him for no particular reason. She was tired. She'd been awake for 19 hours. She let her eyes rest somewhere, and that somewhere happened to be the window. Then she saw the mechanic stand up too fast, grab the side of the gear housing. His other hand went to his face. She sat up straighter. He took 2 steps, lurched, and went down on one knee. Emily was on her feet before she'd consciously decided to move. She hit the door in the end of the jetway corridor at a pace just short of running, because running in a terminal draws security faster than it draws help. She badged through the ground-level door. Her DoD credentials still worked, whatever Briggs thought about her authorization, and pushed out onto the tarmac. The air hit her like a wall. Exhaust, jet fuel, the particular chemical sweetness of hydraulic fluid baking in the sun. And underneath it, something sharper, something that wasn't supposed to be there. The mechanic was on both knees now, one hand braced on the tarmac. His name tag read, Devin. His face was the color of old putty, and he was breathing in short, shallow pulls, the kind of breathing that meant his body was working hard to move air it couldn't fully process. Emily dropped her bag and went to him. "Hey, Devin, can you hear me?" He looked at her. His pupils were constricted. I'm fine. You're not fine." She pressed 2 fingers to the side of his neck, pulse rapid, thready. "What did you breathe in? What were you working on?" The hydraulic line. Under the rear gear, there's I don't know what it is. It was leaking, and Did you smell something sweet, like almonds?" He blinked slowly. "Yeah, that was enough." She had her phone out and was dialing before she'd finished the thought. Not Marcus Webb, not airport security, but the Harwick Medical Center Poison Control Consult line, because she knew from a trauma case 2 years ago that hydraulic fluid contamination with certain chemical additives could look deceptively mild for the first 4 minutes before the neurotoxic component crossed the blood-brain barrier, and she was not going to let that happen to this kid on a runway at 7:50 in the morning. The consult nurse picked up in 11 seconds. Emily gave them the exposure description, the symptom presentation, the timeline. She was calm. She was specific. She did not use any words that required repeating. While she waited for the call back, she positioned Devin on his side. He was starting to lose fine motor control in his hands, which was the next marker, and checked his airway. Clear. She elevated his legs slightly using her own bag as a wedge because the angle of the tarmac worked against her. "Stay with me," she said. "What's your last name?" "Halverson." "Devin Halverson. I'm Emily. I'm a trauma nurse. I'm not going anywhere." The aircraft," he said. His voice was thickening. I don't know if the line—" She looked up at the aircraft. A thin ribbon of smoke was curling from the forward section of the fuselage. Not from the engines, from somewhere behind the nose, from the electronics compartment. And then the smell hit her. Not hydraulic fluid now, but the acrid, specific bite of burning insulation. Electrical fire. Emily looked back down at Devon, then up at the aircraft, then at the open tarmac around her, where, in the 7 minutes since she'd walked out of the terminal, exactly 0 ground crew had come to investigate either the mechanic down on the asphalt or the threat of smoke coming from a military transport aircraft full of passengers. She stood up. "Hey!" She was shouting now, waving at the nearest ground vehicle 20 yards out. "Fire alert! Electronics compartment! Forward fuselage! Get airport emergency response, now! And I need an emergency medical kit out here. This man has chemical inhalation." The ground crew driver stared at her for one long, stupid second. "Now!" she said. He grabbed his radio. What happened next was not smooth. Emily would think about it later, lying in a hotel room in Blackridge 2 nights after, and the word that kept coming to mind was ugly. Not heroic, not cinematic. Ugly. The way real emergencies always were, full of people making wrong decisions for 3 seconds before they made the right ones, full of things going sideways that shouldn't have, full of the specific exhaustion that came from having to be the loudest voice in a room that should have already been moving. Airport fire response arrived in 4 minutes. In those 4 minutes, smoke had begun seeping through the forward cabin door seal, visible from the jetway window. A flight attendant had opened the main cabin door, the right call, and passengers had begun deplaning, some orderly, some not. Captain Briggs was at the front of the aircraft doing something on his headset that Emily couldn't hear from the tarmac. The airport's emergency medical technicians arrived behind the fire truck. Emily flagged them immediately. Chemical inhalation, probable hydraulic fluid with solvent additive. He was exposed for approximately 12 minutes before symptoms presented. Constricted pupils, rapid thready pulse, progressive loss of motor control in the extremities. He needs IV access, supportive care, and toxicology consult. I've already got Harwick poison control on callback. She handed them her phone, which was still showing the case number from the consult line. Everything I told them is in there. One of the EMTs, a woman with her hair pulled back and the efficient, unimpressed expression of someone who'd seen too much to be rattled, nodded once. "Copy. We've got him." Emily stepped back. She watched them work for 30 seconds to make sure the handoff was solid, that they'd understood the exposure timeline, that they weren't going to lose the detail about the neurological progression. And then she turned back toward the aircraft. The fire team had a suppression unit deployed at the forward fuselage. The smoke had thickened, gone from ribbon to plume, but it was electrical smoke, not structural, not fuel-fed, the kind that looked worse than it was if you got the suppression on it fast enough, which they had. The fire team leader was a heavy-set man named Corrigan. She'd catch his name off his jacket later. And he was running coordination between 2 suppression lines and the aircraft's ground crew, who had finally materialized in numbers. Emily stepped up beside him. "I can help route the passengers who need medical assessment. Some of them were exposed to the smoke before the cabin door opened." He looked at her. "You cleared to be out here?" She held up her DOD credentials. "Trauma nurse. Former Army. I've got Harwick poison control already consulted on the mechanic. Same exposure risk applies to anyone who is in the forward cabin." Corrigan considered this for approximately 1 second. "Forward cabin passengers left side of the gate apron. Keep them separated from the rest." "Copy." She worked the next 20 minutes the way she'd worked every mass casualty event she'd ever run, not by taking over, but by filling the gaps. Identifying the 3 passengers whose smoke exposure had been significant enough to warrant monitoring. Finding the flight attendant who'd been coughing and checking her oxygen saturation with the pulse ox she kept in her bag out of habit. Because old habits from the Army didn't disappear just because you changed jobs. Keeping the separated group calm, which mostly meant giving them information, because people in crisis didn't need platitudes, they needed facts. You're going to be assessed by the medical team. The smoke you were exposed to is electrical, not chemical. The fire is contained. You are not in danger right now. It worked better than everything is going to be fine every single time. At some point during those 20 minutes, she became aware that Captain Briggs was standing 20 feet away watching her. She didn't look at him. She had a passenger in front of her with an elevated heart rate and shallow breathing that was probably anxiety rather than inhalation injury but needed to be confirmed, and Captain Briggs was not her concern. She was almost done, almost at the point where the trained emergency personnel had everything covered and she could step back, when she heard the sound of vehicles. Not airport vehicles, something heavier. She straightened up and looked toward the service road at the perimeter of the tarmac. A convoy of black SUVs, 4 of them, rolled onto the tarmac access road in the specific, unhurried formation that meant federal, not local. Behind them, a dark blue government sedan with a set of small flags mounted on the front quarter panels that she recognized immediately because she'd worked in enough buildings with enough people who rated that specific emblem to know exactly what it meant. Office of the Secretary of Defense. Emily Voss Carter, who had been on her feet for 20 hours, who still had smoke on her scrubs, who had been escorted off this aircraft less than an hour ago for being in the wrong place, stood very still on the tarmac of Vance Regional Airport and waited to see what happened next. The convoy stopped. The rear door of the sedan opened. A woman stepped out in a charcoal suit, military aides moving into position around her with the automatic precision of people who did this every day. She was in her mid-50s with close-cropped silver hair and the posture of someone who had spent decades in rooms where posture was noticed. She looked around the tarmac, assessed it with one long sweep, and then her eyes found Emily. She started walking directly toward her. Captain Briggs, to Emily's left, had gone very quiet. The woman stopped 4 feet away. She didn't extend her hand. She looked at Emily the way you looked at someone you'd been briefed on, recognizing rather than meeting. "Specialist Carter," she said. It was not a question. Emily felt something shift in her chest. Not surprise exactly, more like the particular disorientation of being seen clearly after a long time of being looked through. "Ma'am," she said. The woman's gaze moved briefly to the contained smoke still rising from the aircraft's forward section, to the EMTs working on Devin Halverson, to the separated group of forward cabin passengers Emily had been managing. Then it came back. "Walk me through what happened out here," she said. "From the beginning." Behind her, Captain Nolan Briggs had not moved. But Emily noticed, without looking directly at him, the way you notice things in the Army without making it obvious, that his clipboard was no longer pressed to his chest. It was hanging at his side, and his face, for the first time since 7:42 that morning, had no expression on it at all. Emily told her everything, not because she was ordered to, not because she wanted to make a point, but because the woman in the charcoal suit was asking specific questions that deserved specific answers, and Emily had been trained to give information accurately under pressure, and that training didn't care who was listening. She described Devin's presentation, the symptom timeline, the consult call, the fire, the suppression, the passenger triage. She described it the way she would have described it in an after-action report, sequentially, without editorializing, with the relevant clinical details in the right order. The woman listened without interrupting. When Emily finished, there was a short silence. "And before all of this," the woman said, "what happened in the terminal?" Emily glanced at Briggs, then back. "I was asked to leave the aircraft." "Why?" "The captain determined my authorization wasn't valid." "Was it valid?" "Yes." The woman nodded slowly. She turned to look at Briggs. Just looked at him. No expression. The way you looked at a problem you were going to have to deal with shortly. And then she turned back to Emily. "I'm Secretary Hale," she said. "Victoria Hale. I know who you are, Specialist Carter. I've known who you are for 18 months. Emily said nothing. "Program Callaway, Fort Orland, Mira Ridge." The secretary listed them without emphasis. "Your protocols are in the current field manual. The training cycle you ran last spring produced the highest first-time certification rate in the program's history." Emily kept her face neutral. Behind Secretary Hale, she could see the military aides, the federal agents, the airport emergency staff, all of them occupying their own business. And Briggs, still standing there, still holding that clipboard at his side. "I only did the work," Emily said. "That's exactly right," Secretary Hale said. "You did the work. All of it, without announcement." She held Emily's gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then she turned and looked at Captain Briggs, and her voice changed in a way that was subtle but unmistakable. Not louder, not harder, but more deliberate, the way a judge's voice changed when the reading of something official began. "Captain Briggs," she said, "you removed an authorized federal contractor from a secured military transport on the basis of what exactly? Her uniform?" Briggs's jaw moved. You were acting on an assumption," the secretary said. "One that put your passengers, your aircraft, and your runway at considerably greater risk than the passenger you dismissed." The tarmac around them was not quiet. There were still fire crews and EMTs and airport personnel doing their jobs, but the space that had formed around the four of them felt completely still. Briggs opened his mouth again, closed it. Secretary Hale had already turned away from him. "We need to discuss your transport to Black Ridge," she said to Emily. "There's a replacement aircraft being arranged, and I'd like you with me." Emily looked down at her scrubs. Still smoke-smudged, still the navy blue she'd put on 18 hours ago for an overnight shift she hadn't even had time to go home from. "I need to check on the mechanic first," she said. "Devin Halverson. He was the first patient." Secretary Hale paused. Then something almost like a smile crossed her face, there and gone in less than a second. "Of course," she said. "She what?" Emily picked up her bag from where she'd left it on the tarmac, still propped under Devin's legs, retrieved now by the EMTs who had left it neatly beside their kit. She crossed to where Devin was sitting up on a gurney, looking less gray than he had 25 minutes ago, an oxygen mask over his face and an IV line in his left arm. He watched her approach. "You're the one who—" His voice was muffled by the mask. "Yeah." She checked his color, the rise of his chest. Better. Still needed monitoring, but the acute phase had passed. "You did the right thing crouching down when you felt it. That kept the concentration lower." "I didn't know what I was doing." "Doesn't matter, it worked." He looked past her at the convoy of government vehicles, the aides, the woman in the charcoal suit watching from 20 feet away. "Who is that?" Emily looked back over her shoulder. "Someone who was supposed to be on that flight," she said. She didn't explain further because it wasn't her story to tell, and because the EMTs needed to move Devin to the medical bay, and she needed to step back and let them do their jobs. She stood up, adjusted her bag on her shoulder. Across the tarmac, Captain Briggs was speaking with two men in military dress uniforms who had emerged from one of the black SUVs. He was nodding. He had the particular posture of a man who understood for the first time the exact weight of what he had done. Emily turned away from him. Not from satisfaction, not from anything, really. She turned away because there was nothing left for her to do in that direction. Secretary Hale was waiting. And somewhere across the tarmac, the replacement aircraft was already being cleared. The replacement aircraft was a smaller Meridian Air configuration. Fewer seats, no overhead video system, the kind of stripped-down transport that existed purely to move people from one place to another without pretending it was anything more than that. Emily found her seat near the middle of the cabin, shoved her bag into the overhead bin, and sat down with the particular bonelessness of someone who had been running on adrenaline for the last 40 minutes and had just felt it leave her body all at once. Her hands, she noticed, were steady. They were always steady during. It was the after that got her. She pressed her palm flat against her thigh and breathed out through her nose, slow and deliberate. A technique Reyes had taught her in the tent on her first deployment when she'd shaken so hard after a successful resuscitation that she'd knocked a tray of instruments off the cart. "You don't shake during because there's no room for it," he'd said. "Your body saves it, so you've got to give it somewhere to go on purpose, or it finds somewhere on its own." She gave it somewhere to go. 3 breaths. Then she was fine. Secretary Hale boarded last, preceded by 2 aides and followed by a man in army dress greens whose rank insignia Emily clocked automatically. Colonel, Medical Corps, before she'd consciously decided to look. The secretary took a seat in the forward section. One of her aides, a young woman with a tablet and the focused expression of someone managing 14 things at once, paused briefly at Emily's row. "Secretary Hale would like a word when we're airborne," the aide said. "Understood." The aide moved on. Emily looked out the window at the tarmac below, where the original aircraft was still surrounded by fire crew and airport vehicles. Smoke no longer visible, but the disruption of it still spread across the ground like the aftermath of something that had needed to happen to teach someone something. She didn't know if it had taught Briggs anything. She suspected men like Briggs were better at cataloging grievances than absorbing lessons, but that wasn't her problem to solve. The aircraft rolled. She watched the terminal disappear behind them. At cruising altitude, one of the aides came to get her. Secretary Hale was sitting in the two-seat forward section with a coffee she hadn't touched and a folder she'd closed when Emily approached. She gestured to the seat across from her without preamble. "Sit." Emily sat. "I'm going to tell you something," Hale said, "and I need you to hear it as information, not as a judgment of what you did this morning." Emily waited. "Program Callaway is being restructured." Hale folded her hands on top of the closed folder. "Effective in 6 weeks. The DoD is absorbing it into a larger joint medical preparedness initiative. Interagency, broader scope, more personnel. The contractor model goes away. The positions convert to direct appointments." Emily processed this. "And the existing contractors?" "Are being evaluated for appointment, not automatically transitioned." Hale let that sit for a moment. "There are people in the evaluation process who have been watching how Program Callaway's personnel handle themselves outside of structured training environments." "Is that what today was?" "Today was an aircraft fire and a downed mechanic." Hale's voice was completely level. "I don't manufacture situations to assess people, Specialist Carter. I don't need to." Emily believed her. Something about the way Hale delivered information, without decoration, without softening, had the quality of a person who had stopped performing straightforwardness at some point and simply become it. "What's the joint initiative called?" Emily asked. "Merit, Medical Emergency Response Integration and Training." Hale picked up her coffee, looked at it, put it back down. "It's bigger than Callaway. More reach, more complexity, more political interference from people who understand neither medicine nor military logistics, but have opinions about both." She looked at Emily directly. "It needs the kind of people who do not need to be told twice and do not need a title to act." Emily held her gaze. "You're describing a job." "I'm describing a context," Hale said. "The job conversation happens after Blackridge through proper channels, with your formal evaluation documentation and someone from my staff who is considerably better at HR than I am." She almost smiled. The same brief, contained expression from the tarmac. "I am not good at HR." I noticed. This time the smile made it a half-second longer. "Go get some rest," Hale said. "You've been awake how long?" 21 hours. "Go sleep. We land in 2 hours." Emily stood, paused. There was one thing she wanted to say, and she wasn't sure it was her place, but she'd learned in the Army that the things you didn't say because they weren't your place had a way of becoming the things you regretted. "Captain Briggs?" she said. "I don't know what happens to him from here. That's not my area. But the flight attendant, Nadia, her name tag said, she opened the cabin door the right way, at the right time, without waiting for instruction. She kept people calm when the smoke started. She's the reason the forward cabin evacuation didn't turn into something worse." Emily paused. "I don't know if anyone is going to remember that in the incident report." Hale looked at her for a moment. "It'll be in the report," she said. Emily nodded, went back to her seat, closed her eyes. She didn't sleep, but she stopped moving, which was close enough. Blackridge was smaller than Emily had expected from the name, the kind of city that called itself a city because it had a convention center and a minor league baseball team, but was really just a town that had grown too fast and hadn't finished deciding what it wanted to be. The hotel they'd been assigned was clean and mid-range and had a vending machine on every floor, which Emily noted as a practical positive because she still hadn't eaten. She had 40 minutes before the pre-ceremony briefing. She used 20 of them to shower, pull on the one set of civilian clothes she'd packed, dark slacks, a plain gray blouse that did not look like she'd slept in it, which felt like a minor victory, and eat a granola bar from the vending machine standing in the hallway outside her room, because sitting down felt like a commitment she wasn't ready to make. Marcus Webb called while she was still in the hallway. "I just got the incident report summary," he said. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine." Emily. "An aircraft fire. A downed—" "I'm fine, Marcus. Devin Halverson is stable. The fire was contained. Everyone is accounted for. I'm fine." A pause. Briggs is being suspended pending investigation. That came through an hour ago. She didn't say anything. You don't have feelings about that? I have a lot of feelings, she said. None of them are useful right now. That's incredibly on brand for you. She could hear him rubbing his face through the phone. Hale talked to you on the plane. It wasn't a question, which meant he already knew, which meant Secretary Hale's office moved faster than most of the medical units Emily had worked with, and she'd worked with some fast ones. She mentioned the restructuring, Emily said. Merit. And she said the formal conversation would happen after Blackridge. Emily, his voice shifted. Less operational, more human. This is a big deal. What she's describing, the scope of Merit, the appointment versus contractor thing, that's not a lateral move. I know what it is. Do you want it? She looked at the end of the hallway. A window there, looking out over a parking structure, and past that, the edge of whatever Blackridge called a skyline. A few office buildings, a water tower, the flat Midwestern sprawl of a place that worked hard and didn't make a lot of noise about it. I don't know yet, she said. Which was true. Ask me on the other side of today. Fair. He paused. The ceremony, you know there are going to be cameras. I assumed. Local press, military documentation team, and apparently a veteran advocacy journalist who's been covering the recognition series for the past year. Her name is, I have it here, Petra Vance. She's good. Not the gotcha kind, but she's thorough. Okay. I'm just saying, after this morning, if anyone has connected the Vance regional incident to your name before the ceremony, then they have. I can't do anything about that from a hallway in Blackridge. Right. Another pause. How's the hotel? Vending machine on every floor? That's a win. That's exactly what I thought. She hung up, ate the last third of her granola bar, took the elevator down to the lobby, where Secretary Hale's advance team had already set up a briefing table near the back of the conference area with the efficient, invisible-feeling thoroughness of people who did this in every city and had long since stopped noticing the rooms. The briefing was 12 people in a room designed for 30. Secretary Hale, her 2 aides, the colonel from the plane whose name turned out to be Colonel Darius Fenn, 4 additional military personnel Emily didn't have context for, a civilian from the Veterans Transition Office named Carol Whitmore, who had brought her own pen and used it constantly, and 3 people connected to the ceremony's organizing committee, one of whom kept glancing at his phone in a way that suggested something was already wrong. His name, Emily would learn in about 6 minutes, was Garrett Lowe. He was the executive director of the Blackridge Veterans Recognition Foundation, and whatever was on his phone was making him progressively paler in real time. Secretary Hale opened the briefing with a summary of the day's schedule. Ceremony at 4, reception to follow, the recognition of 11 veterans, 2 posthumous, and then looked directly at Garrett Lowe. Is there something you need to share with this room? She said. Lowe looked up from his phone. He was mid-40s, the kind of man who ran charity organizations because he was good at organizing people and events, and had done well enough professionally that he could afford to care about things, but who now looked like a man who had agreed to host something much larger than he'd understood at the time. There's been a development, he said. One of the veterans being recognized today, Sergeant Marcus Delray. Lowe exhaled. He checked himself out of Vantage Rehabilitation Center this morning, against medical advice. We don't know where he is. The room went quiet. Vantage, Colonel Fenn said. That's the polytrauma facility on the north side. Yes, he's been there for 14 months. Spinal injury, TBI, double amputation below the knee. He's ambulatory with prosthetics, but they're saying he was in significant distress when he left. The staff tried to reach his emergency contacts. His sister isn't answering. His case manager is... Lowe set his phone down. We have a veteran who is somewhere in this city, alone, in physical and emotional crisis, and his recognition ceremony is in 4 hours. Emily had been quiet in the corner of the room, the way she usually was in any room where she wasn't the one running things. Now she looked at Colonel Fenn, who was looking at Hale, who was looking at Lowe with the expression of a person assembling a response in real time. What triggered this? Hale asked. We don't know exactly. His case manager thinks it was There was an incident earlier this week at the facility. Another patient, an altercation. Nothing physical, but verbal. Something was said about Delray's injuries, about what he's able to do now. The kind of thing that shouldn't be said and was. Loa's jaw tightened. He'd been doing better. 3 weeks ago, he was doing better. The room absorbed this. Emily thought about what that meant, doing better, in the context of a man who had been in a polytrauma facility for 14 months, who had lost both legs below the knee, who had sustained a brain injury that nobody ever fully described with honesty until you'd worked with patients who had them. Doing better in that context was not the same better as anywhere else. It was a different country with different terrain, and the distance between better and crisis could be crossed in a single conversation. "I'd like to help look for him," Emily said. Everyone looked at her. She kept her voice even. "I've worked with polytrauma patients. TBI presentation, double amputation, the specific pattern of what happens when someone in that recovery stage gets destabilized. I know what to look for. I know how to approach someone in that state without making it worse." She paused. "I'm not a search coordinator, and I don't have jurisdiction. But if you're putting people on the ground, I'd rather be one of them than sitting in this hotel." Hale looked at her for a moment, then at Fenn. Something passed between them that was too fast and too professional for Emily to fully read. "Carol," Hale said to the woman from the Veterans Transition Office, "coordinate with Vantage's case management team and get us the last known location data from his discharge paperwork. Garrett, his sister's name and last known contact." Lo was already pulling it up. "Fenn," Hale continued, "I want 2 of your people on this. Plain clothes, no pressure, no uniforms." She looked back at Emily. "You're with Fenn's team." Emily nodded. "And Specialist Carter." Hale's voice didn't change register, didn't add weight to the words, which somehow made them heavier. "We're looking for a man, not conducting a recovery operation. The goal is conversation. Is that clear?" "Completely," Emily said. She pulled out her phone, checked the charge, 73%, enough, and followed Colonel Fenn out into the hallway, where the afternoon light was coming through the lobby windows at a low angle that turned everything the color of something almost ending, and the city outside waited in its ordinary way, full of streets where a man with 2 prosthetic legs and a fractured sense of his own future could disappear very completely if he wanted to. Fenn handed her a radio earpiece from his jacket pocket. Small, discreet, the kind she'd used in training exercises at Mira Ridge. Delray was seen leaving the facility on foot, heading south on Kerrigan Avenue, he said. That was 90 minutes ago. His last prosthetic fitting was 2 months out. He can cover ground, but not fast. South puts him toward the River District. Lots of places to sit, lots of places to not be found. Who's his case manager at Vantage? A man named Dr. Osei. He's standing by if we need clinical consult. Emily put the earpiece in. What was said to him, the altercation earlier this week? Fenn was quiet for a half-second too long. Fenn. Another patient told him he was only being recognized because the Army felt guilty. He said it flatly. That without his legs, he wasn't a soldier anymore. He was a liability with a medal. Emily stopped walking. She stood in the middle of the lobby with the afternoon light turning everything gold around her and felt the specific located anger of someone who had spent years watching institutions fail the people they were supposed to protect and then felt it compress, the way she'd learned to compress things, into something she could use instead of something that used her. Let's go find him, she said. They went out through the lobby doors into the Black Ridge afternoon, where somewhere south on Kerrigan Avenue, a man who had given more than anyone in that recognition ceremony building would ever fully understand was sitting alone with the worst version of what someone had told him about himself. And she had no way of knowing, yet, that finding him was only the first problem. The second problem was already waiting at Vantage Rehabilitation Center, in the form of a formal complaint filed that morning against Dr. Osei, the one person who knew Delray's case better than anyone, and a facility administrator named Ronald Spears who had decided, with breathtaking timing, that today was the day to take Osei off active case status pending a disciplinary review. The River District was the kind of neighborhood that had been something else before. Light industrial, probably, given the width of the streets and the loading dock architecture still visible on the older buildings, and hadn't entirely finished becoming what it was now, which was coffee shops and converted lofts, and the occasional art gallery sitting next to a plumbing supply warehouse that hadn't gotten the memo. The sidewalks were wide and uneven. The river itself was visible at the end of every cross street, flat and gray-green in the afternoon light, moving slow enough that you could mistake it for not moving at all. Emily walked south on Kerrigan with Fenn's second officer, a woman named Specialist Tara Oduya, who was in plain clothes, jeans, a Black Ridge State windbreaker, and carried herself with the particular stillness of someone trained to be present without being visible. They'd split from Fenn 3 blocks back. He was working the east side. They had the river. Oduya had a photograph of Delray on her phone, facility intake photo, 14 months old, before the rehabilitation work, before the prosthetics were calibrated, before whatever the last 14 months had done to the architecture of his face. Emily had looked at it once, memorized what she could, and stopped looking at it, because the man they were looking for was not the man in that photograph, and treating the image as definitive was how you walked past someone who needed to be found. "He'll be sitting," Emily said, "somewhere with a clear sightline and limited approach angles. Not hidden. He's not hiding from us. He's hiding from the version of today he can't handle. There's a difference." Oduya glanced at her. "How do you know?" "Because he left on foot. If he wanted to disappear completely, he'd have called a cab or taken a bus. He walked. That means part of him is still in conversation with the world. He's just doing it on his own terms." Emily scanned the street ahead. "Look for benches with river views. Anything with a low wall he could sit against. He'll want his back to something solid." Oduya nodded and didn't ask how Emily knew that either, which Emily appreciated, because the answer, 14 months working polytrauma cases on her off-rotation at Harwick, learning to read the specific behavioral grammar of men and women whose bodies had been remade by violence and who were still trying to figure out what that meant, took longer to explain than they had. The radio earpiece crackled. Fenn's voice. "Checking the Riverwalk benches on the east approach. Nothing yet. Oduya, what's your position?" "South Kerrigan, approaching the Delwood footbridge," Oduya said. "Copy. Vantage is on the line. Dr. Osei has been pulled from active status. Administrator Spears is now primary point of contact for Delray's case." Emily stopped walking. "Spears," she said. Not a question. "Confirmed. Spears has been advised of the situation and has declined to provide Delray's psychiatric consultation notes to civilian search personnel." A pause in Fenn's voice that was doing a lot of work. "He says it's a privacy issue." Emily stood on the sidewalk and thought several things in rapid sequence, none of which she said out loud, because Oduya was watching her and the radio was open and neither venue was appropriate for what she was thinking about Ronald Spears and his privacy issue. "Does Dr. Osei still have his phone?" she asked. "Presumably." "Then we call Dr. Osei directly, not as Delray's active case manager, as a consulting clinician providing background information to a search team in the field. Different legal footing." A pause. "That's a narrow argument," Fenn said. "It's a correct one, and we don't have time for a wide argument." Another pause. Then, "Stand by." Emily and Oduya kept walking. The Delwood footbridge came into view at the end of the block, a wide pedestrian span over a tributary channel that fed into the main river, with concrete railings and a set of benches midway across where the view opened up in both directions. Emily had never been to Blackridge before this morning. She was working from pattern, not map. But she saw him before they reached the bridge. He was not on the bridge. He was below it, on the narrow concrete ledge that ran along the channel wall, a maintenance walkway, maybe 2 feet wide, accessible from a set of utility stairs tucked under the north approach. He was sitting with his back against the channel wall, both prosthetic legs extended in front of him, a jacket balled up behind his head. He wasn't looking at the water. He was looking at the underside of the bridge above him. Emily touched Oduya's arm, stopped her. "I see him," Oduya said quietly. "Stay here." "Carter." "I'm not doing anything dramatic. I'm just going to go sit near him." She met Oduya's eyes. "If I need you, I'll say cold, and then you come down. Otherwise, give me 10 minutes. Oduya didn't look fully convinced, but she nodded. Emily went to the utility stairs. The ledge smelled like river water and concrete baking in the afternoon heat, and the particular mineral dampness of a place that flooded a few times a year and had learned to live with it. Emily descended the stairs at a normal pace, not cautious, not announcing herself, just moving the way you moved when you weren't a threat and wanted that to be legible without making a production of it. She walked to a spot on the ledge about 8 feet from Marcus Del Rey and sat down with her back against the same wall, her bag in her lap, and looked out at the channel. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. She counted to 40 in her head before she spoke, because 40 seconds was usually the threshold between intrusion and presence, and she needed him to feel the difference. The echo under here is interesting, she said. Not to him directly, just into the air. He didn't respond, but he didn't tell her to leave. It takes the sound from the street and makes it sound farther away than it is. She listened to it. Traffic noise, someone's music from a passing car, the city going about itself 3 feet above their heads. I like that. Silence. My name is Emily, she said. I'm not from the facility. I'm not with the police. I'm a nurse, and I came to Blackridge for the ceremony today, and I ended up being the one who went looking for you, which is not how either of us planned to spend the afternoon. She heard him exhale. Not quite a laugh, but not hostile. You weren't supposed to tell me you were looking for me, he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected, deliberate, each word placed carefully in a way that sometimes came from TBY and sometimes came from a man who had learned to think before he spoke because the other version had cost him too much. I know, she said, but I figured you'd already worked out that I wasn't here by accident, so lying about it would just waste time. A pause. How'd you find me? You walked south. You wanted a river view with something solid behind your back. She kept her tone completely neutral. It narrows the options. He looked at her then, for the first time, directly. He was 34 according to the briefing notes, but the face looking at her had done a different kind of math. Not old, just recalculated. His eyes were dark and careful, and the set of his jaw had the quality of someone who had been managing pain long enough that managing pain had become a baseline state rather than a temporary condition. Are you going to try to talk me into going back? He asked. No. He waited for the catch. I'm going to sit here, she said, for however long you want to sit here, and if you want to talk, I'll listen, and if you don't want to talk, that's fine too. She paused. The ceremony isn't until 4. We have time. He looked back at the water. 2 minutes passed, then 5. She let them pass. She'd learned, in the tent with Reyes, in the trauma bay at Harwick, in the training cycles at Fort Orlan, that the most useful thing you could sometimes do in a high-stakes situation was be willing to do nothing, not performing patience, actually being willing to sit in the silence and let the other person be the one who decided when it ended. He wasn't wrong, Del Rey said. The guy at the facility. Emily didn't respond immediately. She gave the word space. Which part? She said finally. The part about the medal. His jaw tightened. You put a medal on someone and call it recognition, but what they're really doing is closing a file. Here's your hardware, soldier. We're even now. You go figure out the rest. Is that what you think today is? I don't know what today is. His voice had an edge to it now, but not at her. At something further away, something that had been bothering him for longer than this week. I know what I was. Before. I know what I could do. And then I know this. He gestured briefly at his legs without looking at them. And someone's going to pin something on my chest and take a photo, and I'm supposed to stand there and look grateful, and then go back to learning how to walk right, so I don't tip over when the terrain changes. That sounds exhausting, Emily said. He looked at her again, sharper this time, like he was checking if she was being condescending. She wasn't. She meant it. Yeah, he said. It is. She looked at the channel. A piece of debris, a leaf, mostly broken, floated past below them, moving in the slow current. I'm not going to tell you what you're supposed to feel about the ceremony, she said. That's not my place. But I will tell you what I know, which is that the people in that room today will... the ones who set it up, they're not doing it to close a file. They're doing it because you specifically went back for 3 soldiers under conditions that got you where you are, and they need there to be a record of that. Not for you. For the next person, and the one after that. She paused. That's not nothing. He was quiet. It's also okay if it still feels like nothing, she said. Both things can be true. The earpiece clicked. Fenn's voice, low. Carter. We have a situation at Vantage. Spears has contacted local media. He's alleging Dr. Osei falsified consultation records in Delray's case. It's going to be on the afternoon news cycle in approximately 90 minutes. Emily felt the information land in her chest and kept her face completely still. I have to make a quick call, she said to Delray. I'll be right back. She stood, moved 6 feet along the ledge, turned her back, and spoke quietly into the radio. What is Spears' actual position on Osei? Ben. Osei filed an internal complaint 2 weeks ago about understaffing in the TBI unit. Spears is the administrator who was named. The disciplinary review looks retaliatory. Osei's union rep is involved, but it's going to take time. And the media story? Spears gave a statement implying Delray's breakdown today was a result of clinical negligence by Osei. If that runs before the ceremony, it changes the entire narrative around today's event, around Delray specifically. Emily turned back toward the channel. She could see Delray from where she stood, still sitting, still looking at the water, still present. A man in genuine crisis, being used as a weapon in someone else's institutional fight. Get me Dr. Osei's number, she said. Dr. Kwame Osei answered on the first ring, which told her something. People who were being punished by institutions either went silent or went hypervigilant, and Osei was the second kind. Dr. Osei, she said, my name is Emily Carter. I'm a DoD contractor and trauma nurse, currently in the field with the search team. I have Marcus Delray. He's physically safe. I need 30 seconds of clinical context, and I'm not asking as a records request. I'm asking as a colleague in the field making a real-time assessment. A beat. Then, what do you need? His current medication regimen and any known triggers for dissociative episodes. Osei gave it to her, cleanly, quickly, no hesitation, the way doctors talked when they were talking to someone they'd decided was competent, and the stakes were high enough to skip the posturing. Delray was on a mood stabilizer and a low-dose antidepressant, both appropriate for TBI sequelae. His primary trigger pattern was situations involving perceived public scrutiny combined with physical limitations being made visible, which meant a ceremony in a room full of people where he would be asked to walk across the stage was not a neutral environment. Has he eaten today? She asked. He skipped breakfast. Staff noted it. Low blood sugar on top of emotional dysregulation on top of a destabilizing trigger event. She filed it. One more thing, she said. Spears is going to media, alleging clinical negligence. Osei was quiet for 3 seconds. I'm aware. Is there documentation that contradicts it? Everything I've done for Sergeant Delray's care is documented. Every session note, every consultation, every referral. It's all in the system. His voice was even, but underneath it was something that had been compressed for too long. Spears knows that. He's not making a factual argument. He's making a timing argument. I understand. She paused. I'm going to make sure the right people see the documentation before that story runs. Ms. Carter. Osei's voice shifted. Careful now, not unfriendly. You should know that Spears has contacts. He's been at that facility for 9 years. He has a relationship with the local Veterans Services Office, and one of the board members of the Recognition Foundation, Garrett Lowe. A pause. No, a woman named Sandra Price. She's on the foundation board and also on Vantage's advisory committee. She and Spears have been in the same institutional orbit for a long time. Emily processed this and said nothing for a moment. Thank you, she said. Take care of yourself, Dr. Osei. This is going to move fast. She clicked off and stood still for 3 seconds. The 3 seconds she allowed herself when the problem had just gotten significantly more complicated than it had been 30 seconds ago. And then she walked back to where Marcus Delray was sitting on the ledge with his back against the channel wall. She sat back down. Sorry, she said. Problem? His voice wasn't hostile, just attentive. She was realizing, considerably more aware of his environment than he'd initially presented. The stillness wasn't dissociation, it was control. An administrative one, she said, not yours to deal with. He almost laughed. Actually laughed. A short, rough sound that surprised them both. Everything's an administrative problem when you're in the system long enough, he said. That is unfortunately accurate. A pause. She could feel something shifting in the quality of the silence. Not resolved, but less brittle. She made a decision. I need to tell you something, she said. And I need you to hear it as information, not as pressure. Can you do that? He looked at her. There's a man at Vantage, your facility administrator, who is going to tell a story about you to the press this afternoon. A story about your care there. It isn't true, and there's documentation to prove it, and we're working on stopping it. She kept her voice level. But I'm telling you because you have a right to know that this exists, and because if you hear it first from a news broadcast without any context, it will be worse. Something crossed his face. Not surprise, not anger, something that had the particular exhaustion of someone who had been navigated around instead of talked to for so long that being told a hard thing directly felt almost like relief. Spears, he said. You know him. He cut the night staffing in the TBI unit 3 months ago. 2 nurses for 40 patients after 10 p.m. His jaw tightened. Dr. Osei filed a complaint. After that, everything Osei did with my case got reviewed twice. He paused. What's Spears saying? That your crisis today was a result of clinical errors in your care. The silence that followed that was a specific kind of silence. The kind that happened when someone had expected to be wronged and was proven right, and found that being right about it didn't feel like anything good. He's using me, Delray said. Yes. To get at Osei. Yes. He looked at the water. His hands, which had been resting open on his thighs, closed slowly. What do you need from me? He said. She looked at him. Nothing. I need you to eat something and let the medical team check you over, because you skipped breakfast and you've been out here for 2 hours and your body doesn't care about Spears right now. It needs fuel and rest. That's what I need from you medically. And non-medically? She held his gaze. I need you to decide for yourself whether you want to be at that ceremony. Not for anyone else. Not because you feel obligated or guilty or because someone needs a good photo. For you. She paused. But that's your call. Not mine. He looked at her for a long moment. You're not like the other people they usually send, he said. I wasn't supposed to be on this flight, she said. Long story. He almost smiled. Not quite, but close enough. She reached into her bag, the one that had been wedged under Devin Halverson's legs on a tarmac in a different city that morning, and pulled out the second granola bar she'd taken from the vending machine. She held it out. He took it, looked at it. Seriously? I know, but eat it anyway. He did. She watched the color come back into his face in small, measurable increments the way it did when blood sugar came up from the floor and the body remembered it had resources. When he'd finished, she stood up, held out her hand, not as a social gesture, but as a practical one, because the utility stairs were narrow and she was offering what she had. He took it, got to his feet, a process that had its own vocabulary, its own sequence, weight shifting through the prosthetics in a way that looked considered and stood at his full height, which was several inches above hers. You said long story, he said, about how you ended up here. It is. Tell me on the way back? Deal. They went up the utility stairs and back onto the level of the street, where Oduya was waiting with the controlled relief of someone who had spent 10 minutes not interfering with something they weren't sure would work and had. Emily's earpiece clicked. Ben. Carter, Spears just held a press conference. It's already online. She stopped. How bad? She said. Bad enough that it's been picked up by 2 veteran advocacy accounts with a combined following of 500,000, and Sandra Price just issued a statement in support of Spears's position. A pause. The story's framing Delray as a victim of negligent care, by name, with the ceremony as background. Emily looked at Delray, who had heard none of this through her earpiece but had read her face anyway. She could tell by the way his expression had closed slightly, the quiet resignation of a man preparing to absorb another hit. She made a decision that was above her pay grade, outside her lane, and absolutely the right call. "Get me Secretary Hale," she said. "Fenn." "Carter, I know what I'm asking. Get her." A pause that lasted long enough to be uncomfortable. Then Hale's voice, crisp and direct, came through the earpiece. "Talk to me." Emily talked. She laid it out in 90 seconds. Spears, Price, the media story, Osei's documentation, the board connection, the timing. She didn't editorialize. She gave Hale the structure of it and let her fill in the implications herself, because Hale was clearly a person who didn't need the implications spelled out and resented it when people tried. When Emily finished, there was a silence on the line. "Emily," Hale said. "Not Carter. Emily." "Ma'am, see, how is Sergeant Delray right now?" Emily looked at him, standing on the sidewalk in the afternoon light, worn and real and considerably more present than he'd been 40 minutes ago on a ledge below a footbridge. "He's upright," she said. "He's aware of his situation, and he made his own choice to come back." "Good." Another pause. "Bring him to the hotel. Use the service entrance. I don't want him walking through the lobby with a camera outside." Her voice shifted into the gear Emily had heard on the tarmac, the one that meant things were about to move quickly, and the people not keeping up would simply be left behind. "And Carter, when you get here, I need you in the room for what comes next." "Understood." "Sandra Price," Hale said, almost to herself. "I know that name." The line clicked off. Emily stood on the sidewalk in Black Ridge's River District with a veteran who'd been used as ammunition by a man protecting his own institutional skin, a board member who was about to find out the specific cost of that association, and a ceremony in 3 hours that had just become something much larger than a recognition event. And in the hotel 4 blocks away, Secretary Victoria Hale was making phone calls that Ronald Spears was not going to enjoy receiving answers to. But what Emily didn't know yet, what none of them knew, was that Spears hadn't stopped at the press conference. While they were on the sidewalk, while Hale was making calls, while Oduya was coordinating the route back to the hotel, Spears had done something that made the media story look like a warm-up. He had filed an emergency motion to have the ceremony postponed, on grounds that a patient under active vantage care, Marcus Delray, named explicitly in the filing, was in a state of clinical instability that made his participation a liability to the hosting foundation. The filing had landed on Garrett Lowe's desk 30 seconds ago. And Lowe, faced with a legal document he didn't understand and a board member who was already in Spears' corner, had done what overwhelmed people with limited institutional courage did when confronted by paperwork that looked official. He'd put a call into the ceremony venue to discuss postponement. Garrett Lowe was still on the phone when they walked into the hotel's service corridor. Emily heard him before she saw him, his voice carrying through the door that connected the service entrance to the small administrative hallway behind the conference area. That particular register of a man who was trying to sound authoritative while being completely out of his depth. "I understand the legal concern. Yes, I'm aware of the timeline, but if there's a liability issue with one of the recognized veterans..." She pushed through the door. Lowe looked up. He was standing with his phone pressed to his ear and his other hand braced on the wall like he needed the support. When he saw Delray walking in beside Emily, something complicated crossed his face. Relief and guilt, and the specific embarrassment of someone who'd been caught doing the wrong thing for understandable reasons. Emily held out her hand toward his phone. "Who is that?" Lowe blinked. "The venue coordinator?" "Hang up." He looked at her, then at Delray, then back at her. He lowered the phone and ended the call with the expression of a man who understood, on some level, that he'd just been given a way out of something he'd half known was wrong from the start. "The filing Spears sent you," Emily said. "Can I see it?" Lowe pulled it up on his tablet. She read it in 90 seconds. It was what Fenn had described. An emergency motion dressed in clinical language, citing patient welfare, invoking liability, naming Delray by full name and injury status in a document that was now part of a public record. It was not a legal document in any binding sense. It was formatted to look like one. Spears had counted on Lowe not knowing the difference, and he'd been right. This is not enforceable, Emily said. Spears is a facility administrator. He has no legal standing to block a Department of Defense recognition ceremony for a veteran who is not under emergency commitment and who left Vantage of his own volition as a competent adult. She handed the tablet back. He generated a document that looks like it carries weight because he wanted you to act on it before anyone had time to read it carefully. Lowe took the tablet. His jaw was tight. I didn't know. I know you didn't. She meant it. Lowe was not a bad man. He was a man who ran an organization he cared about and had been handed something frightening by someone who understood how to use institutional language as a weapon. Is Price here? She was supposed to arrive an hour ago. I haven't... His phone buzzed. He glanced at it. She's in the lobby. Emily looked at Oduya, then at Delray. Go with Specialist Oduya. There's a room set aside for the recognized veterans. Eat something real. Let the medical liaison check you over. Not for the facility, just baseline. Can you do that? Delray looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not resentment, not gratitude. Something in between, the way people looked when they were being cared for by someone who didn't make a performance of caring. Yeah, he said. Good. She paused. Save me a seat. He almost smiled again. The same almost as under the bridge. Oduya steered him toward the corridor. Emily turned back to Lowe. Where's Secretary Hale's room? Third floor, 312. He hesitated. Miss Carter, Sandra Price is going to want to talk to the organizing committee before the ceremony. She has opinions about how today should be managed. She's been on the board for 6 years and she's not... He stopped. She's not easy. Good, Emily said, and went to find the elevator. Room 312 was not a suite. It was a standard double with a round table pushed against the window that Secretary Hale had converted into a working surface, covered in printed documents and 2 laptops and a half-eaten sandwich that suggested she'd been up here working since they'd arrived from the airport. One aide was on a phone call in the corner. The colonel, Fenn, was standing with his arms crossed reading something on a tablet, and he looked up when Emily came in with the expression of a man who'd spent the last 40 minutes managing multiple disasters and was cautiously relieved that one of them had resolved. Hale looked up from the table. Delray, she said. With Oduya. He's stable. He agreed to the medical check and he's eating. Emily moved to the table. Spears is filing to Lowe. It's not legally binding. Lowe almost acted on it. Almost? I got there first. Hale nodded once. Sit down. She pushed a printed document across the table. This came through 20 minutes ago from my general counsel. Background on Ronald Spears. Emily sat and read. Ronald Spears had been at Vantage Rehabilitation Center for 9 years, as Osei had said. What Osei hadn't known, or hadn't mentioned, was the 3-year period before Vantage, when Spears had been deputy administrator at a veteran services facility in Harmon County that had been subject to a state investigation for billing irregularities. The investigation had concluded without charges, but with a formal reprimand against the facility's financial management structure. Spears had left 6 weeks after the investigation concluded and taken the Vantage position 11 months later. The gap in his employment record had not been disclosed during his hiring process. Further down, Vantage's most recent CMS audit 8 months ago, had flagged a pattern of understaffing in the overnight TBI unit, the same issue Osei had filed his internal complaint about. The audit finding was marked as requiring corrective action within 60 days. That corrective action had not been completed. Spears had submitted documentation claiming it had been. Emily set the document down. He submitted false corrective action documentation to CMS, she said. That's how my general counsel reads it. Hale picked up her coffee, which was probably cold. The audit flag alone is enough for a formal investigation. The false filing escalates it considerably. He knew Osei's complaint could surface the audit discrepancy, Emily said. So he moved against Osei before Osei could generate more documentation, and he used Delray as the vehicle. A veteran in active crisis, named in a public media statement. Hale's voice had gone very quiet, which Emily was learning meant the opposite of calm. To protect a fraudulent staffing report. Price is in the lobby, Emily said. She's on both the Recognition Foundation Board and Vantage's Advisory Committee. If she and Spears have been coordinating, I know Sandra Price, Hale said. It came out flat, without additional texture, which was somehow worse than anger. We've been in the same rooms a number of times over the years. She's not corrupt. She's loyal to the wrong people for the right reasons, which sometimes produces the same outcome. She set down her coffee. She's going to be harder to manage than Spears because she actually believes she's protecting something. What do we need from her? A public correction of her statement before the ceremony. Hale looked at the time, a physical watch, analog, which Emily had noticed earlier and found oddly reassuring. We have 2 hours and 14 minutes. I'll go down, Emily said. Hale looked at her. I know I'm not the right person on paper, Emily said, but Price doesn't know my history with this yet. To her, I'm a DoD contractor who helped find Del Rey. That's a neutral position. She paused. Give me the documentation on Spears' CMS filing. Let me put it in front of her. Hale studied her for a moment with the expression she used when she was evaluating a proposal that she hadn't generated herself and was deciding whether the instinct behind it was sound. You're not a legal envoy, she said. No, but legal envoys make it adversarial. She needs to understand what she's actually aligned with, not feel like she's being prosecuted. Emily kept her voice even. I'm a nurse. I was the one with Del Rey on that ledge. I can tell her what Spears' actions looked like from the ground level, in human terms, and then show her the documentation. That sequence matters. Hale picked up the document, held it out. Don't threaten her, she said. Don't imply consequences. Let the facts do it. Yes, ma'am. Emily took the document and went back to the elevator. Sandra Price was at the lobby, sitting with a cup of tea she'd ordered from the hotel bar, which struck Emily as a very specific kind of self-possession, the sort that came from decades of being the person in the room who set the temperature rather than adjusted to it. She was 60-something, with white hair cut short and a gray blazer that probably cost more than Emily's monthly car payment, and she was reading something on her phone when Emily approached. Ms. Price, Emily said, my name is Emily Carter. I'm a DoD contractor working with Secretary Hale's office. Do you have a few minutes? Price looked up, assessed Emily with the particular efficiency of someone accustomed to reading rooms. You're the nurse, she said, the one who found Sergeant Del Rey. Yes. Price gestured to the chair across from her. Emily sat. I want you to know, Price said, that my statement this morning was not intended as an attack on Sergeant Del Rey. I was responding to information provided to me by the facility's administration. By Ronald Spears, Emily said. Yes. I understand. Emily kept her tone neutral. I'd like to tell you about what I saw this afternoon and then show you something, and I'd ask that you hear the sequence in that order. Price set her phone down. Go ahead. Emily told her about the ledge. She told it the way she would have told it to anyone, without drama, without editorializing, with the specific clinical and human detail that made it real rather than rhetorical. She described Del Rey's presentation, the TBI sequelae, the way blood sugar drop compounded emotional crisis, the particular exhaustion of a man who'd been navigating a system for 14 months, while something that had been said to him last week sat in his chest and corroded everything around it. She didn't describe it to make Price feel guilty. She described it to make it real, because it was real, and because the distance between what Spears' statement had implied and what Emily had actually seen on that ledge was the distance between a narrative and a person. When she finished, Price was quiet. Her tea had gone cold. He submitted false documentation to CMS, Emily said, and slid the document across the table. Spears, regarding the corrective action required from the TBI unit audit. The finding was flagged 8 months ago. He reported completion of corrective action that didn't occur. Dr. Osei's internal complaint about understaffing would have generated documentation that directly contradicted Spears' CMS filing. That's why Spears moved against Osei. She paused. And that's the person whose account of Dr. Osei's clinical negligence you supported publicly this morning. Price picked up the document, read it. Emily watched her face eat. The way it moved through stages, not quickly, with the controlled progression of someone who had learned that showing reaction too fast was a liability. But the color at the base of her neck was rising, and her mouth had tightened in the specific way of someone absorbing the understanding that they'd been used. "Where did this come from?" Price said. "Secretary Hale's general counsel. It's all documented. The original CMS audit, the corrective action submission, the date discrepancy." Emily let a beat pass. "Ms. Price, I'm not here to tell you what to do with this. I'm here because you're on the foundation board for an event that recognizes veterans, and one of those veterans spent his afternoon on a ledge under a bridge partly because a statement you issued gave credibility to something that wasn't true. You deserve to know that, and you deserve to know why it happened." Price set the document down. She looked past Emily at the lobby. The ordinary afternoon traffic of a mid-range hotel, people with rolling luggage, a couple studying a map near the door. "I've known Ronald Spears for 7 years," she said. It wasn't a defense, it was just information she was processing out loud. "I understand," Emily said. "He's never—" She stopped. "I didn't know about the audit." "He counted on that." Price picked up her phone, looked at the statement she'd issued, put the phone face down on the table. "What does Secretary Hale need from me?" she said. "A correction. Before 4 o'clock. Your own words. I'm not going to draft it for you." Emily paused. "And if you're willing, a direct conversation with the ceremony organizing team about the status of Spears' postponement request. Lowe needs to hear from someone he trusts that the filing was not what it appeared to be." Price was quiet for a moment. "I'll call Garrett," she said, "and I'll draft the correction." She looked at Emily directly. "Is Sergeant Del Rey going to be at the ceremony?" "That's his decision. I'm not going to make it for him." Price nodded slowly. She had the expression of someone in the early stages of a recalibration. Not pleasant, but necessary. "You're very direct for someone who says she's not a legal envoy." "I'm a trauma nurse," Emily said. "We don't have a lot of time for preamble." She stood, shook Price's hand, and went back to the elevator. By 3 o'clock, 4 things had happened in rapid succession, which was how the afternoon kept moving. Not smoothly, but in the particular lurching rhythm of a situation where the right people were finally working in the right direction and the wrong people were running out of places to redirect the momentum. Price issued her correction at 2:47. It was clean and unambiguous. She had issued her earlier statement based on information she now understood to be incomplete. She retracted her support for Spears's characterization of Dr. Osei's clinical conduct, and she expressed confidence in the integrity of the recognition ceremony and the veterans being honored. She did not mention Spears by name, which Emily suspected was a deliberate choice, and which, she decided, was fine. The retraction did what it needed to do. Lowe, having spoken with Price and then with the Foundation's actual legal counsel, not Spears's version of legal concern, but a real attorney who had read the filing in 12 minutes and confirmed everything Emily had told him, formally rejected the postponement request, and issued a statement reaffirming the ceremony's schedule. Colonel Fenn's team, working with the DoD's Inspector General Office, had forwarded the CMS audit documentation and Spears's false corrective action filing to the appropriate federal oversight channel. Emily had been told this by Fenn in a 30-second exchange in the hallway outside room 312, delivered in the same tone he used to report everything, which was the tone of a man who had learned that information had weight and didn't need additional packaging. And Dr. Kwame Osei, who had spent the morning on administrative suspension in his office at Vantage, received a call from Vantage's parent health management organization, not from Spears, but from the organization's compliance director, who had apparently been watching the afternoon's news cycle with increasing alarm and had decided that the distance between Spears's public statement and the organization's own audit documentation was a gap they needed to close before someone else closed it for them. Osei was reinstated to active status pending a formal review. Spears was placed on administrative leave. Emily found out about Spears's leave from Marcus Webb, who called while she was standing in the hallway outside the veterans' preparation room trying to eat a hotel cookie she'd taken from the conference table because she still hadn't eaten a real meal. "Spears is out," Webb said. "Leave pending investigation. Vantage's parent company is distancing. The parent company's PR statement went up 18 minutes ago." "How's the media story tracking?" "The original Spears narrative is losing traction. 3 of the veteran advocacy accounts that shared it have either deleted the share or posted corrections. A pause. Osai gave a brief statement. Just facts, no editorializing. It's running better than Spears's version. Emily ate the last of the cookie. Marcus, when the investigation into Spears's CMS filing concludes, what's the exposure? For Spears? Submitting false documentation to a federal regulatory body for a facility receiving federal funding? Webb's voice was careful. If the investigation bears out what the documentation suggests, we're looking at potential federal fraud charges. At minimum, decertification of the facility's Medicare and Medicaid participation would be on the table. 11 veterans in that TBI unit, overnight shift, 2 nurses. I know. The investigation needs to include current staffing conditions, not just the filing. I'll make sure the right people hear that. A pause. Emily, how are you holding up? She thought about this with more seriousness than the question usually warranted. I'm tired, she said. I've been awake for... She checked her watch. 27 hours, but I'm okay. You're going to crash. After the ceremony. After the ceremony, he agreed. Go be where you're supposed to be. She hung up, pushed open the door to the veterans' preparation room. There were 11 of them. Some in dress uniform, some in civilian clothes. The ceremony had made allowance for both, because a recognition event that required veterans to perform military formality to receive acknowledgement had always struck Emily as getting something fundamentally backwards. They ranged from early 30s to late 60s. Some were talking, some were quiet. A woman near the window with her arm in a sling was laughing at something on her phone. 2 men near the coffee table were deep in a conversation that had the quality of people who'd served in adjacent units and were comparing notes on geography neither of them had expected to ever revisit. Delray was sitting on a folding chair near the back wall, in a dress shirt and dark slacks that someone had apparently helped him track down. Not full dress uniform, but clean and deliberate. He'd eaten. Emily could tell by the color of his face, which had moved from the flat gray-white of the ledge to something warmer and more present. He looked up when she came in. Spears is on leave, she said quietly, pulling a chair over. He absorbed this without visible reaction for a moment. The CMS thing? That and what comes with it. She paused. Dr. Osei is back on active status. Something moved across Delray's face. Not triumph, nothing as clean as satisfaction, something more complicated and more honest. The particular expression of someone who had been wronged in a quiet, systematic way for a long time and was only now watching the first solid evidence that the wrong was going to have a name attached to it. He's a good doctor, Delray said. Osei, he's the reason He stopped, looked at his hands. He's the reason I got to the point where I could leave the building on my own. I know. But the ceremony today, he looked up. Is it going to be a whole thing about this morning? That's Secretary Hale's call, Emily said honestly. But I don't think she's the type to turn someone else's hard day into a story about herself. He considered this. What about you? Are you in the ceremony? No, I'll be watching. You should be, he said. Not in a grateful way, in a factual way, which Emily found she preferred. I'm staff, she said. I don't get recognition for doing my job. That's how it's supposed to work. He looked at her for a long moment. Yeah, he said. It is. She stood up. The ceremony was in 47 minutes, and there were things that still needed doing. The venue coordination that Lowe's team had scrambled to reassemble after the near postponement, the medical liaison check that Fenn's aide was still completing for 2 of the other veterans, the logistical sequencing of 11 people with varying mobility needs, and 1 Secretary of Defense, whose security detail had specific requirements about how entrances worked. Emily had ended up threading through all of it over the past 2 hours, not because it was her job, but because the gaps were there and she knew how to fill them without making a production of it. She went and filled the gaps. The Blackridge Veterans Recognition Ceremony was held in the main hall of the Meridian Civic Center, which seated 400 and had been filled to 360 by the time the doors closed at 4:15. Emily sat in the 3rd row from the back on the right side, not in the reserved section, not with Hale's team, just in a chair that was there and available because her job for the afternoon was to watch, not to be watched. Secretary Hale spoke for 9 minutes before the recognitions began. She did not mention Spears. She did not mention the morning's events at Vance Regional Airport. She did not mention the afternoon's near postponement. She spoke about service, not in the abstract patriotic way that service got talked about in rooms like this, but in the specific operational way, about what it cost and what it required and what it looked like from the ground level when the people doing it didn't think anyone was paying attention. "We don't always see service when it's happening," Hale said. "That's partly because the people doing it are too busy doing it to make sure it's visible. Today is about making it visible. Not for the people being recognized. They already know what they did. For everyone else in this room." Emily listened and thought about Devin Halverson on the tarmac, and about Marcus Delray on the ledge, and about the 2 nurses covering 40 overnight TBY patients, and about Dr. Osei sitting in his office under suspension with a documentation trail that told the truth, and a facility administrator who'd counted on no one looking at it carefully enough. The recognitions began. One by one, 11 names were called. When Marcus Delray's name was announced, Emily sat up slightly in her seat without meaning to. She watched him walk from the designated waiting area to the front of the room. The particular gait of a man who had learned to walk again after losing both legs below the knee, measured and deliberate and not slow, not performing normalcy, but not hiding from the reality of it either. He moved across the stage with the same quality she'd seen on the utility stairs under the bridge, considered, sequential, weight distributed through knowledge earned. He stopped at the podium. Secretary Hale pinned the recognition medal to his lapel, not to his chest, which Emily noted, because Delray had positioned himself so the pinning would land just below his shoulder, which kept it more visible, and also, Emily suspected, because he'd made a deliberate choice about how he wanted this moment to sit on his body. Hale said something to him quietly that Emily couldn't hear from the 3rd row from the back. Whatever it was, Delray nodded once. He turned to face the room. He didn't give a speech. He hadn't been asked to, and he didn't volunteer one. He stood there for 3 seconds, 3 full seconds, looking at the room, looking at him, and then he nodded again to the room and walked back to his seat. 360 people in the Meridian Civic Center stood up. Emily stood too. She didn't clap harder than anyone else. She didn't make it a moment about herself. She clapped because the man deserved it, and because the room was right, and because sometimes the correct response to something being done properly was to acknowledge it without complicating it. The ceremony ran another 40 minutes. When it ended, the organizing team had arranged a reception in the adjoining hall, appetizers, the kind of understated spread that said we cared enough to do this right, but we also knew the veterans wouldn't want it to be fussy. Emily got a plate of food that constituted the first actual meal she'd had since the granola bar on the tarmac, and ate it standing near a window, watching the room work. She saw Price approach Delray near the center of the space. She watched, not listening, too far away for that, as Price said something, and Delray listened, and then said something back. She couldn't read his expression from across the room, but he didn't walk away, which was enough. She was finishing the last of her food when Hale materialized at her shoulder with the particular quality of a person who had been in motion all day and had not yet stopped. "The Vantage Parent Organization has issued a full statement," Hale said. "They're cooperating with the federal audit and have committed to an independent staffing review of the TBI unit." "That's the right start," Emily said. "It needs to be independent, not internal." "That's what I told them." Emily set down her empty plate. "And Spears?" "His legal representation has been engaged. He'll have a process, same as anyone." Hale's voice was even. "But the documentation exists, and it says what it says, and the people who need to work through it will work through it." She paused. "The captain from this morning, Briggs, his formal disciplinary hearing is scheduled for next week. The airport has completed its incident summary. The mechanic, Halverson, has been discharged from the medical bay and is recovering." Emily nodded. "There's one more thing," Hale said. "A journalist named Petra Vance spoke with me this evening. She's covering the recognition series. Marcus told me about her. She wants to tell the full story of today. Not just the ceremony, the whole arc, starting with the airport this morning." Hale looked at Emily steadily. "She asked if she could speak with you." Emily looked at the room, At Delray across the space, in conversation with two other veterans now, his posture different from this morning, less braced for impact. At Low near the entrance, looking the particular kind of relief that came from having nearly done the wrong thing and having been steered away from it. At Oduya, who was off duty now and had a plate of food and was talking to one of the ceremony staff with the ease of someone who moved between work and not work without a visible seam. "I'll talk to her," Emily said. "Not about me. About Osei. About the staffing issue at Vantage, and what happens when oversight mechanisms exist, but nobody checks whether the corrective actions are real." "That's a story," Hale said. "That's the actual story," Emily said. Hale looked at her with an expression that had moved past assessment into something quieter. "The merit appointment," she said. "I want to formalize it when we're back in the city. I'll have my office contact you Monday." "Understood." Emily paused. "I'd want to build in a clinical oversight audit function, not just training, a way to flag when facilities serving veterans are out of compliance with staffing standards." "Write it up," Hale said. "Bring it to Monday's meeting." She moved back into the room. Emily watched her go, the way she moved through people, efficient without being cold, purposeful without performing purpose, and thought about what it meant to have spent a day this long, in this many directions, and still feel like the ground was solid. She was thinking about this when her phone buzzed. Marcus Webb. She stepped out of the reception hall into the corridor and answered. "You need to see something," he said. His voice had a tone she hadn't heard from him before, so not alarmed, but coiled. "Spears's legal team filed a motion 90 minutes ago. I just got access to the document." "What motion?" "He's alleging that the documentation shared with the CMS oversight channel today was obtained improperly and selectively edited. He's claiming the audit finding was being actively contested by the facility before the complaint was filed, and that the timeline of events today represents coordinated retaliation orchestrated by—" Webb stopped for half a second. "By you." Emily stood in the corridor outside the reception hall. The sounds of the event filtered through the closed door, by voices, movement, something like normalcy proceeding 12 hours after it had almost been stopped. "He's naming me specifically," she said. "You and Secretary Hale's office. He's alleging the merit restructuring gives Hale a political incentive to discredit veteran care facilities that operate outside DoD-affiliated networks, and that today was a manufactured crisis used to justify federal intervention in a private facility. The logic was bad, and they both knew it. But bad logic, in a legal filing, with a named defendant who had no institutional backing and a Secretary of Defense who was already politically exposed enough that her opponents would enjoy the distraction, bad logic could do real damage before it was refuted. "It's going to be in the press by morning," Webb said. "Yes," Emily said. "Emily, I know." She looked at the closed door of the reception hall. "I need you to pull everything. Every record of my involvement with Callaway, every training log, every certification issued under my protocols. I need to be able to put my full documented history in front of anyone who asks and have it take less than 10 minutes to read." "That's already assembled. I did it 2 hours ago." She almost smiled. "Of course you did." "What are you going to do?" She looked down the corridor at the exit doors at the far end, through which the Blackridge evening was visible. Dark now, the last light gone, the city beginning its overnight version of itself. "I'm going to sleep," she said. 6 hours? And then I'm going to be where I need to be." She hung up, stood in the corridor. Spears, from administrative leave, had just done the thing that frightened people in Emily's position did when they saw the ground collapsing. He had reached for the only remaining tool available to him, which was the allegation, the reframing, the attempt to make the person who had found the truth into the story instead of the truth itself. It was a move that sometimes worked. What Spears did not know, what he couldn't know, because he had never looked at Emily Carter's record with any more care than Captain Briggs had looked at her travel authorization that morning, was that every protocol she had ever written, every training cycle she had ever run, every decision she had made from the moment she stepped onto that tarmac to the moment she'd sat on a ledge under a footbridge with a veteran who'd been abandoned by the same institutional failures Spears represented, was documented. All of it. in a federal system that Spears had never been cleared to access and had no idea she'd spent 18 months contributing to. The filing would run by morning. And by morning, what would also be running, forwarded by Marcus Webb at Emily's specific request to Petra Vance, who was thorough and not the gotcha kind, was a complete verified timeline of Ronald Spears' 9-year tenure at Vantage Rehabilitation Center, including the staffing complaint, the audit finding, the false corrective action filing, the suspension of Dr. Osei, the public statement naming Marcus Del Rey, and the motion filed this evening. Everything in sequence. Everything with dates. Emily Carter had never needed anyone to announce who she was. But tomorrow, the record was going to do it anyway. She slept for 6 hours and 14 minutes, which was longer than she'd planned and exactly what her body had decided without consulting her. The alarm went off at 5:40. She lay still for 30 seconds, the way she'd learned to in the Army, not hitting snooze, not bargaining with the morning, just letting her brain confirm that she was awake and the day had begun and there was work to do. Then she got up, she showered, made coffee from the room's single-serve machine, which produced something that technically qualified as coffee in the same way that technically qualified as a lot of things. Opened her laptop. Petra Vance's story had gone live at 4:17 in the morning. It was 1,100 words, clean, precise, sourced. It began with Spears' press conference and walked backward through the day. The audit finding, the false corrective action filing, the complaint against Osei, the timing of the media statement naming Del Rey, the emergency motion to postpone the ceremony. Vance had obtained comment from the Vantage parent organization's compliance director, from Garrett Lowe, and from a CMS spokesperson confirming an active review had been opened. She had Osei on record, briefly and specifically. The complaint filed against me was retaliatory in nature, and the documentation supporting that conclusion is comprehensive. Spears' legal team had provided a statement. It was 4 sentences. It referenced the motion filed the previous evening, characterized the events as politically motivated, and promised more information to follow. Vance had placed that statement in the 9th paragraph. Emily read the story twice. Then she opened the second article, a different outlet, a veteran advocacy publication that had shared Spears' original narrative the day before. Their follow-up was shorter, but more direct, a retraction of the prior share, a summary of Vance's reporting, and an editor's note that said, "Without decoration, we should have waited for more information before amplifying this story. We didn't. That's on us." She closed the laptop, drank her not-quite coffee. Outside, Blackridge was doing what mid-sized cities did at 6 in the morning. The particular gray-light stillness of a place between its overnight self and its daytime one, delivery trucks and early joggers and the first shift of people who kept everything running before anyone else was awake enough to notice. She thought about Ronald Spears somewhere in this city or already on his way out of it, reading the same story she'd just read, and understanding that the motion he'd filed last night, the one naming her, the one meant to reframe the narrative, had not landed the way he'd needed it to. That the sequence Vance had constructed was too documented, too specific, too sourced to be repositioned by allegation. That the gap between what Spears had submitted to CMS and what the facility had actually done was not an argument about interpretation. It was a gap between a number and a different number, and numbers didn't care about framing. She wasn't glad. That surprised her a little. She'd expected something adjacent to satisfaction, and found instead something closer to the feeling she had after a long code. The particular exhaustion that followed the use of a lot of precise energy over a sustained period, and the quiet at the end that wasn't peace exactly, but was the absence of emergency, which sometimes felt the same. Her phone buzzed. Webb. "You're up," he said. "Since 5:40. Story's tracking well. The veteran advocacy community is sharing the Vance piece. The original narrative has effectively collapsed." A pause. Spears' legal team withdrew the motion at 2 in the morning. Emily set down her cup. "They withdrew it?" "Filed a notice of voluntary dismissal. No explanation." Webb's voice was dry. "My read is that someone looked at the documentation Vance cited and decided the motion was going to accelerate attention they didn't want. Or someone advised Spears that naming a DOD contractor and a Secretary of Defense in a retaliatory filing, with federal fraud charges forming behind it, was not a strategy with good odds." "That too." A pause. Emily, the CMS review. They've expanded scope. They're now looking at Vantage's billing records for the past 4 years, not just the staffing issue. She was quiet for a moment. 4 years was a long time. 4 years of veterans in a TBI unit with inadequate overnight staffing, covered by documentation that said otherwise, billed to federal programs on the basis of care standards that weren't being met. She didn't know what the full number looked like yet. She suspected it was going to be significant enough that even the people who had never heard of Vantage Rehabilitation Center were going to find it significant. The 11 veterans in the overnight TBI unit, she said. The independent staffing review the parent organization committed to. It starts Monday. The CMS review team will have parallel access. Make sure someone with clinical background is on the independent team, not just administrators. I'll pass that along. A pause. There's one more thing. Hale's office called at 6:15, the merit appointment. They want to move the formal conversation to tomorrow instead of Monday. Her schedule shifted. Tomorrow works. Her aide told me this, not Hale directly, because Hale apparently doesn't do anything directly that involves acknowledging she has feelings about things. She said to tell you that Sergeant Del Rey asked for your contact information last night before he left the reception. With the note that he wanted to send you something, Emily looked at the window. The gray light city was beginning to brighten at the edges. Okay, she said. That's all you've got? Okay. What do you want me to say? I don't know, something human. I am being human. I'm just a human who doesn't perform feelings for an audience. She paused. Thank you, Marcus. For yesterday. All of it. A beat of silence. Go eat a real breakfast, he said. You haven't eaten since the reception. She had, actually. She'd grabbed a plate at the reception. But she understood the sentiment. She hung up, got dressed, went down to find breakfast. The hotel's restaurant was half full at 6:30, mostly business travelers and a few people from the ceremony's out-of-town contingent who recognized her with nods that she returned and didn't convert into conversation because the morning was a thing she needed to move through at her own pace. She ordered eggs and toast and actual orange juice and ate at a table by the window looking out at the street. She was on her second cup of coffee when Petra Vance came in. Vance was 40-something, with the specific kind of tiredness that came from filing a story at 4 in the morning and then monitoring its traction for 2 hours before giving up on sleep and starting her day. She had a notebook in her hand, physical, spiral-bound, and she looked at Emily across the restaurant with the particular expression of a person deciding whether to approach. Emily gestured to the chair across from her. Vance sat down, ordered coffee from the server, opened her notebook, looked at it, closed it. The motion Spears filed, she said. Naming you. I know about it. It was withdrawn, Emily said. At 2 a.m. Yes. Vance looked at her. I didn't include it in the story. I made that call around midnight when the withdrawal looked likely, and including it would have given it weight it didn't earn. That was the right call, Emily said. I thought so. My editor disagreed. We had an argument about it. Vance's jaw shifted slightly. I won. Emily drank her coffee. I'd like to write the full story, Vance said. Not just last night's piece, the whole day. The airport, the flight, Del Rey, the ceremony, the Callaway program. What merit is. She paused. Your part in all of it. The Callaway program is classified, Emily said. The existence of it isn't. The outcomes aren't. The training certification numbers aren't. Vance held her gaze. I'm not going to write about things that shouldn't be written about. I'm going to write about a DOD contractor in Navy scrubs who got removed from a military transport at 7 in the morning and then spent the next 12 hours making sure that a mechanic didn't die, that a veteran got to his ceremony, and that a facility administrator who falsified federal compliance documentation didn't get to frame himself as the victim. She paused. That's not a classified story. That's a human one. Emily looked at her notebook. If I talk to you, and I'm not confirming that I will, it's not about me. It's about the systemic issue, the audit finding, the understaffing. What happens when oversight documentation is falsified and no one checks until something breaks in public view? Agreed. And Del Rey controls his own narrative. You talk to him separately and you use only what he consents to. That was already my approach. Emily looked out the window. A delivery truck was backing slowly into a loading bay across the street, the driver leaning out the window to judge the distance, doing the small, precise work of an ordinary morning. "The thing I want people to understand," Emily said, and this was not a calculated statement. It was the thing that had been sitting in her chest since she'd stood on the tarmac being watched by an entire aircraft full of strangers, and hadn't known yet what the day was going to require, is that I didn't do anything yesterday that required special access or special authority. What I did required being present, paying attention, and knowing what I was looking at. She paused. Spears had 9 years and full administrative authority and used it to build a record that looked correct from the outside. I had 27 hours and a DoD travel authorization and a bag I take everywhere because old habits die hard. She looked back at Vance. Authority doesn't guarantee accuracy. Position doesn't guarantee judgment. The people who understood what was actually happening yesterday were the ones close enough to the ground to see it. Vance was writing. She wrote fast, with the focused economy of someone who had learned to capture the thing that mattered inside the thing being said. "Captain Briggs," Vance said without looking up. "The pilot—" "His disciplinary hearing is next week," Emily said. "That process belongs to the military. I don't have anything to add to it." "Do you feel like you're owed an apology?" Emily considered this with more seriousness than Vance might have expected. "I feel like apologies are the least interesting part of accountability," she said. "What I care about is whether the next nurse who boards a military transport with valid documentation gets to stay on the aircraft. That's the change that matters. Whether Briggs says sorry to me personally is—" She shook her head slightly. "That's between him and his conscience." Vance looked up. "That's a complicated answer. It's a complicated question." Emily finished her coffee. "I've been dismissed by people with more authority than Briggs, and I'll probably be dismissed by people with more authority than him in the future. The dismissal isn't the thing I'm interested in. What I'm interested in is what happens after it." She paused. "What you do with the 20 minutes after someone tells you that you don't belong somewhere, that's the thing that actually shapes anything." The formal conversation about merit happened the next morning in a conference room at the federal building in Blackridge that Hale's team had commandeered for 48 hours. The way government operations sometimes materialized in spaces and then dematerialized, leaving only a slightly different arrangement of furniture to prove they'd been there. The meeting was Hale, Emily, Colonel Fenn, a woman from the DoD's legal team named Adrienne Shore, who had the focused precision of someone who read contracts the way other people read novels, and Marcus Webb on speakerphone from 3 states away. Emily had stayed up until midnight writing the proposal Hale had asked for. It was 7 pages. It outlined a clinical oversight audit function embedded in the merit structure, a standing team with the authority to conduct unannounced compliance reviews of federal-funded rehabilitation facilities serving veterans, with the ability to generate binding corrective action requirements rather than recommendations. It included a protocol for whistleblower protections for clinical staff who reported violations, modeled on an existing framework she'd found in the CMS documentation and adapted for the specific institutional pressures of veteran care facilities. She'd written it because she'd been asked to. She'd written it the way she wrote everything, practically, specifically, without performing expertise but without underselling it either. She knew what she was talking about because she'd seen what she was talking about, and that was enough. Hale read it in 8 minutes while Emily sat across from her and drank more hotel coffee that still wasn't quite right. Shore was already marking sections with a pen. Fenn was quiet in the way Fenn was always quiet, attentive without performing attention. Hale set it down. "The whistleblower protocol," she said. "You modeled it on the CMS framework." "Yes." "The CMS version has gaps in the protection for clinical staff who report staffing violations specifically. The facilities have found ways to characterize reporting staff as disruptive rather than whistleblowing." "I know. I flagged it on page 5. The proposed modification requires a mandatory 30-day freeze on any adverse employment action against a reporting staff member pending independent review." Hale looked at page 5. "Sure. It's workable," Shore said. We'd need to address a few jurisdiction questions on the adverse employment action freeze. Some facilities operate under state labor law in ways that complicate federal overlays, but the structure is sound. Then we address the jurisdiction questions. Hale looked back at Emily. The oversight audit team. You'd want clinical backgrounds. Primarily, at least 2 nurses and a physician on every audit team, plus a financial compliance specialist and someone with TBI-specific rehabilitation expertise. The clinical team has to be able to identify whether the care being documented is the care being delivered. That's not a skill set administrators have, and it's the gap that Spears exploited. Spears, and presumably others, Fenn said. Presumably others, Emily agreed. Vantage isn't unique, it's just the one that got looked at. The room was quiet for a moment with the weight of that sentence. Webb's voice came through the speakerphone. The CMS billing review at Vantage. Preliminary scope is 4 years. They're looking at whether the staffing levels documented in billing submissions match the actual staffing records. If the pattern holds, it will hold, Emily said. Spears was systematic. Systematic people don't make exceptions. If it holds, Webb continued, the exposure for Vantage's parent organization is in the range of 40 to 60 million in fraudulent federal billing. Criminal referrals to DOJ are likely. The number sat in the room. Emily looked at the conference table and thought about $40 to $60 million billed for care standards that weren't being met, spread across 4 years, in a unit where veterans with traumatic brain injuries woke up at 3 in the morning and needed someone who knew what they were looking at. 2 nurses. 40 patients. She thought about Delray on the ledge, about the way he'd said doing better, that careful, loaded phrase, about a period that had ended with someone telling him he was a liability with a medal. Doing better in that unit under those conditions, with that staffing, in that environment, and he'd still made it to the ceremony, had stood on that stage and faced 360 people without flinching, the things people did despite the systems that failed them. Emily, Hale's voice pulled her back. Sorry. The appointment. Hale folded her hands on the table. Senior Clinical Advisor, Merit Initiative, GS 15 equivalent, direct appointment. The oversight audit function you've proposed would operate under your office. She paused. That's what I'm offering. Emily looked at her. The appointment meant leaving Harwick Medical Center, where she'd worked nights for 3 years and knew every quirk of the trauma bay and the names of every security guard and the specific way the elevator on the 4th floor stuck between floors if you didn't hold the button for 2 full seconds. It meant leaving the contained, comprehensible world of a single hospital's trauma unit for something that operated across facilities, across states, across the specific institutional complexity of federal healthcare programs for veterans. It meant being the person who found the next Spears before he had 9 years to build a record that looked correct from the outside. She thought about Osei in his office, reinstated but still processing the specific injury of having been used as a vehicle for someone else's self-protection. About the 2 nurses in the overnight unit who had spent months covering a floor they couldn't cover properly and had probably known it and had filed nothing because there was no process that made filing safe. There was a process now. Or there would be once Shore worked through the jurisdiction questions. I'll need to give Harwick 4 weeks' notice, Emily said. 4 weeks is acceptable. And I want to write the clinical audit protocol myself, with input from working nurses, not administrators. That's an explicit requirement, not a condition I'd negotiate, Hale said. I wouldn't have asked you to do this if I wanted administrators. Emily looked down at her 7-page proposal, at the corrections and annotations she'd made at midnight in a Blackridge hotel room, tired enough that her handwriting had gotten smaller and more careful the way it did when she was compensating for fatigue with deliberateness. Yes, she said. I'll take it. But Bamas. Ronald Spears was formally charged 6 weeks later. The charges, 3 counts of submitting false statements to a federal agency, 1 count of fraudulent billing under a federal healthcare program, were filed on a Tuesday morning and carried by every veteran advocacy publication that had shared his original press conference narrative, most of them with the same seriousness they'd applied to the retraction. The Vantage parent organization had already settled a preliminary civil action with the Department of Health and Human Services for $44 million, and its board had restructured entirely, with the old advisory committee, including Sandra Price, who had resigned her position 3 days after the ceremony, replaced by a new oversight body with 2 clinical members and a veteran representative. Price's resignation had been quiet. No statement, no press release. Her name simply stopped appearing on the advisory committee's documentation, and a week later she had sent a personal letter to Dr. Kwame Osei. Emily knew about the letter because Osei had told her about it during a phone call they'd had in the 3rd week after Blackridge, when she'd called to tell him about the merit oversight protocol and asked if he'd be willing to consult on the clinical audit criteria. He didn't share what the letter said. He said only that it had been honest, and that honest was harder than most people understood, and that he had decided to accept it. Osei had agreed to consult on the audit criteria. He'd been thorough, exacting, and had identified 3 gaps in Emily's draft that she'd immediately incorporated. He was, as Del Rey had said, a good doctor. Captain Nolan Briggs's disciplinary hearing concluded in the 4th week. The finding? Conduct unbecoming, failure to execute proper authorization verification procedures, misuse of security personnel, and conduct contributing to an unsafe operational environment. The outcome? Removal from Military Transport Command, permanent disqualification from future military transport assignments, and mandatory completion of a 60-hour leadership and professional conduct remediation program before any return to active aviation duty. Emily heard about the outcome from Marcus Webb, who read her the finding summary over the phone with the same tone he used for all official documents, which was the tone of someone presenting information and pointedly not editorializing. When he finished, she didn't say much. She said she was glad the process had worked the way it was supposed to work, and she meant it. That was the whole of what she felt about it. Not vindication, not satisfaction, just the clean, factual sense that a system had functioned. She had too many other things to think about. The first merit clinical audit team convened in the 7th week. Emily had assembled it herself. 2 nurses with combined experience across 3 VA-affiliated facilities, a hospitalist physician named Dr. Ramona Yee, who had done 2 years of military medicine and had opinions about documentation standards that she expressed with the specificity of someone who had personally suffered the consequences of bad ones, and a financial compliance specialist named Gerald Hooper, who had audited healthcare billing for 20 years and described his work with the quiet satisfaction of a man who found the discrepancies other people missed and considered this a calling rather than a job. Their first audit was not Vantage. That was still under federal review and would be for months. Their first audit was a rehabilitation facility in a different state, selected based on a tip from a floor nurse who had used the new whistleblower reporting channel that Shore's team had finalized 3 weeks ahead of the projected timeline. The tip had been specific and documented. The audit found what the tip had described. Emily wrote the corrective action requirements herself in the same chair in her new office, so it's a real office, with a window and a filing system she had organized on her first day and that had already been disrupted by the volume of material moving through it, and sent them with the mandatory 30-day freeze on adverse employment actions for the nurse who had filed the report. She thought about that nurse sometimes. She didn't know their name. The reporting channel was anonymized at intake, but she thought about what it had cost them to file, the specific calculation of risk and conscience that went into deciding to document something that the people above you had decided not to see. She thought about all the people who had made that calculation and decided the risk was too high, and about what it meant to try to change the math on that. It wasn't clean work. It was slow and complicated and full of jurisdiction problems and institutional resistance and people who had been doing things a certain way for a long time and experienced scrutiny as an attack. She had 3 arguments in the first month with officials whose facilities were adjacent to one under review and who felt that proximity was threatening. She had 1 argument with a member of Hale's staff who thought the audit protocol was too aggressive and said so in a meeting in front of 6 people, and she had responded with the specific documented outcomes from the first audit and let that do the talking, and the argument had not been repeated. Hale had not commented on the argument. She had simply continued the meeting, which was the same thing as a comment in Hale's vocabulary. Itam to. Devin Halverson sent her a card. It arrived at her office in the 6th week, forwarded from the Vance Regional Airport's Facilities Department, which had apparently tracked her down through the incident report. The card was a standard thank you card. the kind sold in airport gift shops, a photograph of a generic sunset on the front. The inside pre-printed with gratitude in a font that no one had ever chosen intentionally. He'd written in the blank space below it in handwriting that was careful and slightly uneven, the handwriting of someone whose fine motor control was still recovering. You knew what was wrong with me before I did. I'm back at work. Light duty for now. The supervisor says full clearance in 8 weeks. I thought you'd want to know it worked out. Thank you. Emily put the card in her desk drawer, not framed on a wall, not pinned to a board, in the drawer with the other things she kept in the category of things that mattered and didn't need to be displayed to matter. Marcus Del Rey had sent something the night of the ceremony. She'd been in the corridor outside the reception hall, on the phone with Webb about Spears' motion, and she'd missed the notification. It was a voice message, which surprised her. Most people texted, and something about the choice to use his voice felt like its own kind of statement. She'd listened to it on the plane back from Blackridge the next afternoon. "This is Del Rey," he said. "Marcus, you've got my number from Fenn, I think. I wanted to say, you asked me whether I wanted to be at the ceremony for myself, and I didn't have an answer at the time. I think I do now." A pause. Osei said he was proud of me once. About 6 months in, when I was having a bad week. He said it the way people say things when they really mean them and aren't trying to make it into something. I didn't believe him at the time. Another pause, longer. I believed it today, standing on that stage. I don't know why today was the one that worked, but it was. A breath. I thought you should know that, since you were part of it. She'd listened to it twice on the plane and then put her phone away and looked out the window at the altitude where you couldn't tell what you were flying over anymore. Just the clean white horizontal nothing of clouds. And she'd thought about what it meant to be part of something without being the center of it. About how most of the work that mattered happened in that position. Adjacent, ground level, close enough to see what was actually happening rather than what was supposed to be happening. She called him back 3 days later. They talked for 40 minutes about things that had nothing to do with the ceremony. About Blackridge, about the rehabilitation process, about a book he'd been reading, about the way cities look different at 6 in the morning than they did at any other time of day. It was an ordinary conversation between two people who had ended up in each other's orbit because of a set of circumstances neither of them would have chosen, and who had decided that the orbit was worth maintaining. She didn't analyze it beyond that. Petra Vance's full story ran 8 weeks after Blackridge. It was 4,000 words and ran in a national publication that Emily did not subscribe to, but that Webb forwarded to her at 6 in the morning with a message that said only, "Read it." She read it at her desk with coffee that was finally acceptable because she'd found the right setting on the office machine after 4 weeks of trial and error. Vance had written it the way she'd described she would. The whole arc, grounded in the specific and the human. She'd written about the airport, about Briggs, about what it looked like when a system's assumption about who belonged in a space was wrong, and no one had built in a mechanism for catching that. She'd written about Osei and the staffing complaint and the audit finding and the gap between documentation and reality. She'd written about Del Rey under the bridge, with his permission, in language that he'd apparently reviewed and approved. She'd written about Emily in the 3rd section, carefully and without sentimentality. She hadn't made her a hero in the way that stories about women in uniforms usually made them heroes. The shining, uncomplicated, inspirational version. She'd written her as a person who was good at her job and had spent a long time in rooms where that wasn't enough, and who had eventually ended up in a position where it was, and what that arc actually looked like in human terms without the clean edges. The line Emily returned to was near the end. Carter doesn't talk about her army service the way it usually gets talked about. She doesn't use the word sacrifice. She says she learned to pay attention, and she never stopped. What she did in Blackridge, what she'd been doing for years before Blackridge, intent trauma bays and training facilities and overnight hospital shifts, wasn't about being the kind of person who steps up in a crisis. It was about being the kind of person who is already working before anyone calls it a crisis. Emily read that line and sat with it. Then she put her coffee down, opened the draft of the second audit protocol she'd been working on, and kept going. This is what she would have said if anyone had asked her to summarize it, which no one did because the kind of work she did didn't usually generate the kind of question that invited summary. She would have said, The people who dismiss you are rarely paying attention to what they're actually looking at. They're pattern matching. They see the scrubs and not the training, the age and not the record, the quiet and not the decision happening behind it. That's not unique to medicine or the military or any specific institution. That's a human failure that shows up everywhere, in every system, at every level. It costs a lot. Sometimes it costs lives in the literal sense, and sometimes it costs them in the slower way. The veteran in the TBI unit with 2 nurses for 40 patients, awake at 3 in the morning with no one who knew what they were looking at. She would have said, the answer to being dismissed is not to announce yourself. It's to know what you know, and to do the work, and to let the record build in real time, because the record is the only argument that holds weight in rooms where argument is needed. She would have said, you will sometimes be exhausted and wrong, and you will make calls that turn out to be the wrong calls. And you will have to live with that without using it as a reason to stop making calls. Imperfect judgment in motion is still better than perfect judgment held in reserve, and the people who never make mistakes are usually the people who never do anything that requires being wrong. She would have said, the version of strength that looks like silence from the outside is not silence on the inside. It is the sound of a lot of compressed, directed work that doesn't need an audience to be real. She would have said these things. She didn't because no one asked and because she was busy. There were 8 more facilities on the preliminary audit list. The second team was being assembled. The whistleblower channel had received 4 new reports in the past 2 weeks, each of them from someone who had calculated the risk and conscience equation and decided to file, and each of them deserving of a response that was faster and more protective than what had existed before. Emily Carter, 29 years old, former Army combat nurse, senior clinical advisor for the Merit Initiative, still wearing Navy scrubs more often than anything else because old habits died hard, and navy blue was practical, and she had never once made a professional decision based on what color she was wearing when she made it. Had work to do. She went back to her desk, opened the second protocol, and kept going. The window behind her showed a city going about its ordinary morning, traffic and coffee and deliveries and people arriving at buildings where their ordinary work waited. The particular low light of a day beginning the way most days began, without announcement, without ceremony. That was where most of the real things happened, in the ordinary light, before anyone was watching.